so now we're going to talk about the Roaring Twenties, and this is culture of the 20s and 30s. So women during World War One. Before 1920, women were looked at as very traditional. Married women typically would stay home while the husbands worked. They were looked at as kind of like housekeepers and keepers of the children. Women who did work had jobs in what were known as women's professions, which were teaching or domestic work, which meant in the house, like cleaners or, nannies, things like that. During World War One, when men had to leave their positions to go fight in the war, women filled them. So they would work in factories, clerical positions, sales, transportation, and even construction. This is a picture right here. Women working in a factory in Rhode Island. They are placing the coverings of hand grenades into a liquid that prevents rust from forming. In the middle, it says women working in the welding department at the Lincoln Motor Company during World War One. And then finally, women training at the Lincoln Motor Company in Detroit, Michigan during World War One. Jobs after World War One. The problem was, after the men came home, they wanted their jobs back. Many employers replaced women with men. They believed men should financially support the family and not vice versa. Women did not want to return to the home. They liked having jobs. Businesses were booming and a demand for certain professions increased, such as typists, filing clerks, secretaries, stenographers, and office machine operators. Also department store saleswomen. Few of these women made it to managerial positions, so that means they never really became managers. The majority of them earned less than men in the same job. Discrimination and inequality was also prevalent in the workplace. New women. So during the 1920s, we see this new woman, or this new type of what we know as feminism, start to come about. It started with the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And after this, women began to attend college and earn degrees. They also started to begin driving. They would purchase goods such as ready-to-wear clothing and makeup. Ready-to-wear, what you need to know about this is before, we think of like department stores and things like that now, but before we had department stores, you pretty much just had patterns. And if you wanted something made, you would have to either send off money and they would have to like kind of ship it to you, or they would send you a pattern and you would actually have to cut out the pieces with fabric that you purchase and sew them together. But ready-to-wear clothing means that it was already made. They actually also started to produce makeup, and it began to challenge the social view of women. So this is again another picture here of men and women voting in New York around 1922. We also have what are known as flappers. Flappers were kind of like how do I say this? I'm not going to say we'll say they were kind of loose women, okay? They were supposed to be kind of this revolutionary, I guess, because traditionally women did not really cut their hair. They wore, longer hairstyles. They were kind of proper. But these women who were flappers, they would cut their hair short in a bob. They smoked cigarettes. They drank alcohol in public. They also visited what were known as speakeasies, which were kind of bars. During Prohibition, this is when they had banned alcohol. So you could not purchase, you could not sell, you could not drink any alcohol. It was illegal across the entire United States. And so that is why they popped up these little areas known as speakeasies, which were kind of hidden clubs where you had to know the codes or know, what to say to get in to be able to go get you a drink. So flappers here were able to go, or they, would go to these speakeasies and drink and smoke cigarettes and, They also wore new fashions, brightly colored short dresses, which was very scandalous during this time, right, guys? So short dresses. They also wore high heels, strings of beads. 20s became a time of the female Declaration of Independence. This is a flapper, but this is not who we typically look at as a flapper. Now, this is more kind of what we would, see. Flappers also had way shorter dresses than that, and they also had a lot of beads and things hanging down. Double standard. The flapper became a symbol of rebellion. Churches and schools protested the new clothing, smoking, and drinking of women. They felt that women should not be acting in this way. The older generation viewed the youth as wild and disgraceful. A double standard emerged. Women were held to stricter standards for behavior than men. Women became torn between traditional views and what they consider the new woman. So the traditional view of the woman is that you're this married wife, that you are at the house, you're taking care of the kids, taking care of the family. And the new woman holds a job. They vote, they drink, smoke, whatever. Okay. As a result, marriage changes. Men and women begin to view marriage as an equal partnership. Both agree to the housework and child rearing. Both agreed housework and child rearing were the woman's job. Due to this, more women start to begin working outside the home, and they felt the pressure of juggling work and family. Women spent less time in the home, so they have new machines and technologies that made household chores less time-consuming. So you have the introduction of the washing machine, which was invented in 1920, and the vacuum cleaner. Family changes. So before, children had to help work to make money for the family, and if you notice, that's what we talked about earlier during the Progressive Era when we looked at child labor and things like that. Many of these children actually were married off by around age 18. Through the economic boom of the 1900s, children no longer needed to work. Now they were able to attend school and organized activities with friends. Young children went to daycare because both parents worked. Children were waiting to get married. The adolescent phase changed. You think of adolescence as like your young time while you are, maybe in middle school or high school. Teenagers also had more freedom and they became, able to drive. They also spent more time with friends and often rebelled against their parents. During the 1920s, school was different. School attendance increased during the 1920s. Before the 1920s, school focused on the college-bound student, but after the 1920s, industry jobs became available, so like trade schools. More courses were offered in high school, such as vocational training, to prepare students for industry fields. There was a number of immigrant children increased who did not speak English. The teachers had to teach English, so a lot of these children are kind of left out. If you look here to the left, students in home hygiene and care of the sick in a school for girls in Honolulu, so it was kind of like a pre-nursing class. You also have children in school in Rhode Island, 1922, and then high school students in Trenton, New Jersey with President Coolidge in 1924. Radios. Mass culture began in the 1920s. It heavily advanced through the introduction of the radio. Pittsburgh's KDKA was the first commercial radio station in the United States. It appeared in 1920, and by 1923 there were over 500 radio stations. At the end of the 1920s, over 12 million homes had a radio. So there was no television yet, but radio was the way to go. Phonographic recordings could also be played in the home, and this way Americans were plugged in and they could actually get the news quicker. Instead of newspaper, they could now listen to the radio. So this was a common thing at this time where families would kind of sit down in the family room or the living room, and at the end of the day, they would listen to the news. The first circus is broadcast on the radio in Madison Square Garden. It's the Big Circus, Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey. This is a picture. Also, you have here a milkman is listening to the radio with headphones in 1923. The headphones, I can't zoom in, but they're a lot different than what we would think today. And then we have Thomas Edison sitting next to a phonograph in 1921. We also have magazines and newspapers, which become very popular. So this helped people stay current on news and events. Writers learned how to hook readers by sensational headlines. Remember, we talked about yellow journalism. Yellow journalism never went away, by the way, guys. Yellow journalism still exists today. It is where they create these sensational headlines to try to get people's attention, and really there's not a lot of truth to what the article says. It also included domestic and foreign news events, and Reader's Digest and Time Magazine were founded in the 1920s. Time Magazine is a huge magazine. It's still around today, and also Reader's Digest. This is a cover of Life magazine in 1923. Movies. Movies became a popular form of entertainment. Americans could escape the day-to-day life. By 1930, there were 75% of Americans who attended the movie theater every week. They created movies with sound in 1927, but there were still no color. You're not going to see color until a lot later. Dancing and pole sitting. Okay. This is funny. So, dance marathons were popular. They danced to jazz music for hours. The Charleston, the cakewalk, the black bottom, and the flea hop. You also had pole sitting for some reason, which was a national craze. I'm not really sure why. The whole point was basically who can sit on the pole for the longest amount of time. This is a picture here. William Rupert, a 14-year-old from Maryland, sits atop a flagpole. He has been sitting for 23 days and wore out 3 pairs of trousers. I'm just wondering how he went to the bathroom. Did he eat? Probably not. How did he get water up there? That's what I want to know. Also here, if you look, these are marathon dancers. So again, it was this idea that we're just going to dance and dance until we just fall out. But I don't know what that's entertaining at all, but you do you. Athletes and heroes. We have professional sports becomes popular. The radio, so for people who could not attend the games, they could now start to listen to these games on the radio. Personally, I'll say this from my family, whenever we're watching an Alabama game, I know that my grandfather, for example, he likes to listen to the game on the radio more than he likes to do it or watch it on the television, because he said that the host talked too much. He likes to hear the actual game on the radio better. So some people have their personal preferences. It says that some athletes overcame struggles. It was known as the American Dream. We have Gertrude Edrill, Helen Wells, Andrew Rube Foster, and Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth is here, baseball player. Charles Lindbergh, he was also the most famous American hero, in quotes. You'll have to read also about the Lindbergh baby. His child was actually kidnapped and murdered. Pretty sad. He was the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1927. It gained international attention. We have fine arts. This is all about the culture of the 1920s. Okay, so painters. Some focused on the loneliness of American life, like Edward Hopper. Other painters painted intensely colored paintings, like Georgia O'Keeffe. I think she's got beautiful work. The writers, we have what is known as the Lost Generation. This is made the 20s one of the richest eras in literary history. So you have what is known as the Lost Generation. They ridiculed Americans for materialism. They were considered social realists. They were critical of democracy, prosperity, and peace after World War One. You have F. Scott Fitzgerald, which he's known for The Great Gatsby. This is a great novel if you've never read it. T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, he's one of my favorites. Gertrude Stein and John Dos Passos, he wrote Three Soldiers. You've also have plays that had modern isolationism and family conflict. Eugene O'Neill, who wrote The Hairy Ape. And then composers combined traditional elements with jazz. We have George Gershwin. We have The Great Migration. This is something pivotal in American history. It kind of explains kind of how things are today. In 1890 and 1920, hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the South to northern cities to look for jobs. They wanted to escape Jim Crow and find work. Remember, we talked about what Jim Crow laws were, and we're not done with that because we still have to get to the civil rights movement. By 1930, over 40% of African Americans lived in cities. The northern laws were not as oppressive, but they still faced prejudice from white northerners. In the summer of 1919, there were 25 urban race riots. W.E.B. Du Bois founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909 and fought for the rights of African Americans. And I told you, personally, I liked him, and not that I liked him better. I liked kind of what his views were a little bit more than, Washington's views, Booker T. Washington's views. So they led protests in New York against the violence. Congress did not pass anti-lynching laws, but lynchings did decrease during the 1920s. African Americans still faced discrimination and daily threats. This is where we get into Marcus Garvey. He's kind of looked at as a little more of a radical. So he headed this movement called Back to Africa. He was an immigrant from Jamaica. In 1919, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, known as the UNIA. He believed African Americans should form a separate society. He believed and encouraged his followers to return to Africa and help Native Africans overthrow their white oppressors. So he looked at blacks in America, the Caribbean, and Africa who related to his cause. Support faded because he was jailed for mail fraud, of all things. His plan failed, but it did awaken black pride in the United States, the desire for economic independence, and reverence for Africa. So this is a picture of Garvey and his followers outside the UNIA Printing and Publishing House in 1922. And this is Marcus Garvey on the right. We also get into the Harlem Renaissance, which was probably one of the favorites of the 1920s for me. Very interesting. It centered in New York City's Harlem neighborhood. Harlem was the world's largest black urban community in the 1920s. It featured residents from the South, the West Indies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Haiti. So you had all kinds of different cultures and black families living in Harlem. It also ignited an explosion of cultural pride and glorification of African American music, art, literature, and poetry. So these women right here, see, I just love the way people dressed back then. Just the dresses, the shoes, the hair. I love it. Anyway, it ignited an I'm sorry, I said that already. Economic prosperity. There were new ideas, personal freedoms, and important development in the fine arts. It was led by well-educated middle-class African Americans. Their works reflected what it was like to be black in a white world. Continuing, these are some of the artists and writers. Okay, so Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, Langston Hughes, County Cullen, and Zora Neale Hurston were some of the notable writers during the Harlem Renaissance movement. You have an activity where you're going to be looking at some of the poetry from these guys and ladies. Hughes Hughes was Hughes was the movement's best-known poet. He mixed the rhythm of blues and jazz into his poetry. Shuffle Along was performed in 1921, and many songs became popular with whites. Ethel White performed on Broadway, which was huge. And Paul Robeson was the son of a former slave who became a famous actor. And these are people we just mentioned. Jazz Age. Love this. Love it. All right. If you've never heard of jazz music, I think I can print add some of these things to it. So, Jazz Age. This began in New Orleans in the early 1900s. It spread across the country. You have Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington. Their most popular music for dancing. You have what is known as the Cotton Club, which was the most famous night spot. It was whites only. This is the part that's crazy. It was whites only, but many African Americans musicians performed there. Radio stations would play jazz, and records were sold. Duke Ellington became one of America's greatest composers, and Louis Armstrong also became one of the most influential musicians of jazz. Bessie Smith also, this is Bessie Smith, very pretty woman. She became the Empress of Blues. And in 1927, she was the highest paid black artist in the world. See the feathers, like it's all about the outfits. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is how prime time dress. Like, they were dressed. Love it. All right, movies of the 30s. Cheap to watch during the Great Depression. In the late 1930s, 65% attended the movies at least once a week. They escaped the harsh realities of life. Movies now had color and sound in the 1930s. Some of the notable actors and actresses of the 30s were Clark Gable, Marlene Dietrich, Fred Astaire, who was a dancer. This is Fred Astaire down here. Ginger Rogers, and James Cagney. Some of the famous movies during the 1930s were Gone with the Wind, which starred Clark Gable, The Wizard of Oz, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Monkey Business, and Duck Soup. You had comedies, musicals, romances, and gangster films. This is a man in front of a movie theater in Waco, Texas in 1939. And these are some other pictures of actresses and actors. This is Gone with the Wind. This was the movie poster. Another movie poster, Flying Down to Rio. All right. Radio in the 1930s. Radio sales increased. Almost 90% of households had one. This was known as the golden age of radio. Families spent hours each week listening to their favorite programs. And President Franklin D. Roosevelt would hold what were known as fireside chats to keep Americans informed. You also had Orson Welles. He was known for War of the Worlds. You also have Bob Hope, Jack Benny, and the duo Burns and Allen. These also were people who, just spoke over the radio. Bob Hope was notable. He was an actor. He was also involved during World War II. You've also got soap operas and, for example, The Lone Ranger. So that was pretty popular. This is Orson Welles meeting with reporters to explain that no one connected the War of the Worlds, knew it would cause mass panic. It was fiction. However, it was something that upset a lot of people. But you can look into War of the Worlds. Fine arts and literature. In 1937, the Hindenburg, a German airship, crashed in New Jersey. Americans expected immediate access to news stories through radio and news. Okay. Fine arts of the 30s. Fine arts was more serious during the 30s. It conveyed messages about the strength of character and the democratic values of the the American people. The New Deal works programs supported artists. They were paid to create public art because when we talk about the New Deal post Great Depression, This is another way that Franklin Roosevelt tried to get the American people out of the Great Depression. So they created posters, painted murals on walls of public buildings. They also were paid to teach art in schools. This increased public appreciation of art and promoted positive images of American life. It showed dignity of Americans at work. Grant Wood's American Gothic became one of the most famous paintings of the era. I know that many of you probably won't know this, but maybe you've seen this photo. I think Courage the Cowardly Dog, if you've ever remembered that TV show, they kind of poke fun at this painting. So you might remember it from that. Fine arts of the 30s. Songwriters and singers captured the mood of the Great Depression, and they reflected the hardships of Americans. This is where we get to blues, because it's trying to, it talks about the way everybody was feeling at the time. It was not a very fun time. The Depression was pretty bad, okay? Americans also connected to the literature. John Steinbeck, he wrote The Grapes of Wrath. Richard Wright wrote Native Son. James T. Farrell, Studs, Lonergan Trilogy, and Jack Conroy, The Disinherited. I've read The Grapes of Wrath, but not the other three. I need to check those out. And that is it.